Speedrunners are always racing against the clock to achieve the fastest times. While there are a bunch of different games with each having their own communities and rules, one thing is common between all speedrunners that defines basically what we are: a timer. Timing can vary between a bunch of different speedrunning games, but mostly you have a timer counting up the time based on the real-life clock. However, in Celeste, this is not how we time our runs. We use the in-game timer. Because the developers of these games are so nice, XOK Games thought about speedrunners during development and included a timer in the game. But if you ever actually checked the timer at the end of a Celeste run, you might have noticed that it's nowhere close to the real time that was required to get that time. To explain how this discrepancy happens, it's important to talk about the quirks of Celeste's in-game timer. First up is probably the main thing that contributes to the time difference. The in-game timer doesn't run between chapters. It only runs when inside a chapter, not when on the chapter select screen. Which does mean that short breaks are allowed for Celeste speedrunning, as the menuing isn't included in the runtime. With how hand-intensive the game is, this is greatly appreciated. Even then, there is another timer discrepancy, and that is between the so-called file timer and the chapter timer. The main different use case for these two is that the chapter timer is what we use for individual level runs, so just a single chapter like City, while the file timer is used for full game runs like any %. Even then, if you pay attention to the times of all the individual chapters in the journal, you will see that the time at the chapter end screens is different, as the journal shows the file time of each chapter instead of the chapter time. The chapter timer starts when you're in control of Madeline and ends the moment you lose control at the end of a chapter. The file timer counts more, as it counts everything when you're inside a chapter, so including, for example, the beginning intro animation, be it like walking in or waking up or whatever you can think of, and when dying in the first room of a chapter, the chapter timer would reset, but the file timer would continue in that case. And at the end of a chapter, it only starts when the chapter complete screen starts loading, so the time from activating the cutscene to then skipping the cutscene to the beginning of the load are all included in the file time. An interesting side effect of the difference is that save and quits are faster when doing individual chapter runs, as the timer starts over half a second later on the first control frame instead of the moment you load in. Even so, save and quits can still be used to save in-game time while using file timer, as there are wake-up animations that take so long that quitting out and re-entering is faster according to the in-game timer than waiting for the sleepyhead to wake up. And it's such a small time save that your menuing really has to be on point. Depending on which specific wake-up it is, this time might vary though. Now for the actual weird thing, for which I will let two timers run on the screen for a bit. One being the in-game timer, and one being a real timer. While I mentioned that the timer doesn't run when outside of a chapter, there's one other major thing that allows for the discrepancy between the in-game timer and an outside timer. By now you might have already noticed, if you have keen eyes, but the in-game timer is actually not running synchronized with a real timer. What it actually does is increment every frame by 17 milliseconds, which for a game running at 60 frames per second means that 60 frames would advance 1.02 seconds on the in-game timer, instead of 1 second. And if you extend this to a minute in real time, it would show 1 minute, 1 second and 200 milliseconds. This also means that any in-game time needs to be divisible by 0.017. So sometimes are outright impossible to appear, like 1 minute flat. For speedrunners, that would seem absolutely deal-breaking. A timer not running synchronized with the real time seems unusable at first glance. However, we still actually use the in-game timer for Celeste speedruns despite that. The reason being that the important thing is not actually how accurate it is to real time, but how consistent it is. As long as it follows consistent rules while running all the time during gameplay, it is a good timer. But does it actually run all the time during gameplay? There is one thing in this game that actually causes the timer to pause. The so-called freeze frames. All kinds of different things can cause freeze frames of various lengths depending on what causes it. They cause everything in the game to freeze, including the timer. But as everything freezes, the timer stopping there isn't an issue really. If you would intentionally cause freeze frames, you would still take the same amount of time according to the in-game timer, but just would lose real time instead. And with dashes causing freeze frames, it would make for a less fun experience if you would have to route around a core mechanic to save enough time with each dash to also save the freeze frames it causes. Routing around your dashes is actually not unheard of in this game, because these freeze frame shenanigans have one more side effect. Cassette blocks are the one mechanic in this game that doesn't get affected by freeze frames. These blocks act on a cycle where they will disappear and reappear after a certain amount of time, alternating with different colored cassette blocks. They are so special because compared to everything else in the game, they are tied to the music. And while freeze frames freeze everything else in the game, they don't freeze the music. What this means for speedruns is that if you have to wait, you want to preferably cause freeze frames to let the game, including the timer, pause, but the block cycle advance. With dashes causing freeze frames, you often see some amount of dashes when trying to wait for a cycle in a cassette block room. Each dash saves 3 frames, being the freeze frame length. So if you would do 4 dashes, you'd save 0.2 seconds compared to not doing anything at all. But of course, like mentioned earlier, this would not apply when waiting for other type of blocks, as they are affected by the freeze frames again. Despite all of this, the timer still clearly follows consistent rules that also allows for some fun routing without those routing challenges overdoing its welcome. Its consistency is of course one of the main reasons it's in use, but outside of its functionality, most importantly, this reduces the barrier of entry, so anyone can just enable a timer easily, regardless of platform, and just try a run. Speedrunning communities thrive on new people coming in and giving speedrunning a shot in the first place. A consistent and easy to use timer is pivotal for that.